When the night grows quiet and the day has finally given way to stillness, there is a peculiar comfort in recalling stories that most have forgotten. The weight of centuries can feel in its own way, soothing like the hush of an old library where no one rushes and nothing demands your attention. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let the shadows settle, I'd like to tell you about a figure who has drifted at the edge of America's earliest history. She's a person without a name. You can be sure of a presence woven into a tapestry of secret messages, hidden signals, and quiet courage. They called her Agent 355. Her story is not one of great battles or sweeping declarations, but of small, deliberate acts carried out in the spaces between louder events. She belonged to an invisible company of men and women who, by choosing to remain unseen, altered the course of a revolution. To understand how she came to play her part, you might imagine America in the late 1700s, when the idea of an independent nation was not yet a fact but a fragile hope. The colonies along the Atlantic coast were bound together by shared grievances and fragile alliances. The British Crown, confident in its armies and its ships, had never imagined that this scattered collection of farmers, merchants and dissenters would hold out for long. Yet among the many challenges faced by the revolutionaries, one problem was constant: the need for information. Armies could march and cannons could roar, but without knowledge, without timely, accurate and discreet intelligence, even the boldest plans would collapse. In this quiet contest, the revolutionaries were often at a disadvantage. British officers maintained elaborate networks of informants and sympathisers. Loyalist sentiment was strong in cities like New York, and the Crown's resources seemed endless. So the leaders of the Continental Army began to cultivate their own hidden channels. Among them was a group that would later be called the Culper Spy Ring. Its members were ordinary men and women drawn from the familiar streets of Long Island and Manhattan, asked to risk everything in exchange for little more than a promise that their work mattered. The woman known to us as Agent 355 was part of that hidden world. She was, if the fragments of evidence are to be believed, one of the first female operatives in the service of American independence. Her code name was simple. In the numeric cipher used by the Culper ring, the digits 355 meant simply lady. To be identified in such a way was to be at once specific and anonymous, a woman known for her presence but not her name. Over the centuries, historians have speculated about who she really was. Some argue she was Anna Strong, whose clothes line was used to signal passing messages. Others suggest she was a member of a loyalist family who quietly betrayed British confidences. And there are those who believe she was simply an invention, a legend grown from the need to believe that not every secret was lost to time. But whether she was one woman or a composite of many, her story, real embellished or partly imagined, reflects something that lingers in every age: the uncelebrated labour of those who work in the shadows, who do not ask to be remembered, but whose acts nonetheless shape what the future becomes. If you picture her in your mind, you might see her in a narrow room lit by a single candle. A folded letter rests in her hand. The words are encoded in lines that to any other eye would look like idle correspondence remarks on the weather inquiries about an acquaintance. But beneath each polite phrase is information that could decide the outcome of a campaign. Perhaps she pauses before sealing the note. Perhaps her heart is heavy with the knowledge that discovery would mean ruin not just for herself, but for those she holds dear. Still, she folds the paper, carefully presses wax over the seam, and carries it into the uncertain dark. Most of what we know about her is conjecture. The records of the Culper ring were never meant to be complete. For their safety, for the success of their mission, the agents left as few traces as possible. Names were replaced by numbers, letters were burned. Even George Washington, who understood better than most the importance of these invisible allies, rarely mentioned them by name. That is perhaps what makes this story feel so different from other accounts of the Revolutionary War. It does not centre on declarations signed with a flourish, or battles won with cannon fire. It is a story composed of half-remembered details, the hush of a quiet conversation, the smudge of ink on a hidden report, the soft step of a courier moving through a city at dawn. And in the middle of that half-lit world there is this figure, this lady known only as 355. Some believe that she was responsible for uncovering the treachery of Benedict Arnold. Others claim that she supplied the intelligence that allowed Washington to anticipate British troop movements. Still others think she was captured and died in prison, her name never recorded. In a way, the uncertainty is part of the story's power. To tell it is to acknowledge all the silences in the historical record, those quiet spaces where real lives unfolded, uncelebrated and unrewarded. Tonight you do not need to be certain of every fact to appreciate the shape of what happened. You need only imagine the stillness of a colonial city long after midnight, the hush broken only by the wind slipping through narrow streets. Somewhere in that darkness, a woman moved with steady purpose, carrying a message she could not be sure would ever reach its destination. It is her hidden life and the hidden lives of countless others that we will explore together. As you listen, let each detail be a small comfort, a reminder that in every era there have been those who did what needed to be done, not for fame or reward, but because they believed it was right. When you are ready, we will begin the story. To understand the world in which Agent 355 emerged, it helps to imagine America as it was in the late 18th century, a place of confusion, contradiction, and quiet dread. The colonies along the Atlantic coast were not yet bound together in the way we think of a nation today. They were in many respects 13 separate societies, each with its own customs, fears, and ambitions. Some were older and wealthier, like Virginia and Massachusetts. Others, like Georgia, were still relatively young, their future uncertain. Yet in the years leading to revolution, all were drawn into the slow orbit of resistance. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, many colonists were caught between conflicting loyalties. To remain under the protection of the Crown was for some a matter of prudence. The British Empire was vast, its power undeniable. It seemed unthinkable that a rebellion of farmers and tradesmen could do anything but fail, and yet the idea of independence began to spread like a quiet current beneath the daily business of life. Pamphlets circulated, arguments took shape in taverns and drawing rooms, some families were divided for years, brothers on opposite sides, neighbours watching one another with suspicion. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia and New York, the atmosphere was thick with rumour. One never knew if a passing acquaintance might be an informer, or whether a seemingly casual conversation was being repeated to the authorities. In this climate of uncertainty, George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He was at the time a man of considerable reputation, known for his dignity more than any singular brilliance in battle. But he understood in a way few others did that a war of this nature would not be decided by force alone. Washington knew that intelligence, quiet, consistent and timely, would be as valuable as any regiment of soldiers. The problem was how to gather it. British forces occupied New York in 1776 after the Continental Army was forced to retreat. From that point forward, the city became both a fortress and a hub of loyalist activity. Any effort to spy there carried enormous risk. But Washington could not afford to look away from what was happening behind those stone walls. New York was the heart of British command. Officers planned campaigns from elegant townhouses. Loyalist merchants supplied the army with food and material. Messages flowed through the port to London and back again. If the revolution was to succeed, someone would have to slip inside that guarded world. In time, a small network of informants began to take shape. Some were recruited from within the city itself, shopkeepers, tavern owners, people who had reason to move about without drawing suspicion. Others carried messages across Long Island Sound, risking capture every time they stepped into a boat. This was the world in which the Culper spy ring began its work. Its members did not think of themselves as heroes. Most were ordinary people who had been asked to do extraordinary things. They used code names and ciphers. They left messages buried under loose stones or pinned inside barrels of goods. They committed themselves to secrecy, knowing that even their friends and families would never know the truth. Among them was a woman, Agent 355. Though the details are incomplete, it is widely believed she operated within New York itself, close enough to British officers that she could gather information others could not. She listened to conversations, took note of troop deployments, and learned which loyalists were secretly collaborating with the enemy. In the evenings when the streets were emptying and lamps flickered behind shuttered windows, she may have slipped away to pass her findings to a courier. Perhaps she did this with steady calm, or perhaps her hands trembled as she closed each door behind her. There is no record of what she thought in those moments. No journal survives to tell us whether she believed the cause would prevail, or whether she feared it was already doomed. All we have is the evidence that she did what she was asked to do again and again, even as the war dragged on, even as hope flickered and flickered again. It is easy now to look back and see the outcome as inevitable. The United States exists, and so we imagine that its birth was assured. But in those years nothing felt certain. At times the Continental Army seemed on the verge of collapse. There were winters when soldiers starved in their camps. There were months when Congress could not pay or clothe them. For people like Agent 355, the daily reality of revolution was not a procession of stirring speeches and triumphant victories. It was the strain of never being able to say what you knew of watching each day arrive without promise that your efforts would matter. New York itself was a city of contradictions. In the same street where British officers dined in candlelit comfort, prisoners were kept in makeshift jails, sick and half forgotten. Merchants grew wealthy on army contracts while ordinary families worried about the cost of bread. Some who called themselves patriots grew weary and went home. Others switched allegiances when it became clear the war would be longer and harder than anyone imagined. And yet a few remained steadfast bound not by guarantees of victory, but by the conviction that their quiet work was worth doing. Agent 355 was by all accounts among those few. When I picture her, I imagine a woman moving through crowded rooms, her expression composed and unremarkable. Perhaps she listened more than she spoke. Perhaps she smiled in the right moments and asked the right questions so that no one thought to question her in return. She would have been in every sense unremarkable to those who saw her pass by. That, of course, was the point. To be invisible was her greatest strength, and so she carried her knowledge in silence as the war rose and fell around her. Tonight, as you listen, you do not need to remember every date or every name. Let these fragments be enough, a collection of small truths about an ordinary city caught in an extraordinary struggle. As the war unfolded and as the hopes of the revolution were tested again and again, Agent 355 continued to do her part. In the next part of this story, we will look more closely at the network to which she belonged, and the men and women who risked everything to keep the fragile hope of independence alive. When you hear the phrase Culper spy ring, it may sound grand, as if it were some secretive institution hidden behind heavy doors. But in truth, it was an informal network, a collection of neighbours, acquaintances and friends who came together to do a kind of work most had never imagined for themselves. They did not wear uniforms or carry weapons except in rare circumstances. Instead, they carried information, the quiet currency that in war is more powerful than any musket or cannon. The Culper ring began in 1798 at a time when the American Revolution was in its most uncertain years. George Washington, ever cautious, had become convinced that a reliable flow of intelligence from New York would be essential if the Continental Army were to survive. At that time, New York City was firmly under British occupation. Its harbour was filled with the tall masts of English ships. Soldiers patrolled the streets watching the population for any sign of rebellion. Loyalists lived alongside those who still believed in independence, and no one could be sure who might betray a careless word. Into this landscape stepped Benjamin Tallmadge. Tallmadge was a young officer in Washington's service, just 34 years old. Before the war, he'd been a schoolteacher, and perhaps it was this background that made him meticulous and patient. When Washington entrusted him with the responsibility of gathering intelligence, Tallmadge set about constructing a network that would blend into the life of the city. He gave himself the codename John Bolton. One by one, he recruited men he trusted, each of whom adopted a numeric designation. Abraham Woodhull became Culper Sr., and Robert Townsend was Culper Jr. There were others, couriers, informants, occasional collaborators who lent their eyes and ears. And somewhere among them, though precisely where remains a question, was Agent 355. The Culper ring did not rely on elaborate gadgets or elaborate disguises. Their methods were in many ways as ordinary as the tools of any household invisible ink made from gall nuts. Simple ciphers for transposing letters and signals devised from everyday objects. For example, Anna Strong, who lived on Long Island, would hang her laundry on a clothesline to communicate. A black petticoat signalled that a message was ready to be picked up. The number of white handkerchiefs told which cove the courier should use. To those passing by, the laundry looked no different from any other. But to those who knew, it was a declaration more daring than any shouted slogan. Agent 355's contribution is believed to have centred on her proximity to British officers. Some suggest that she may have worked in the household of Major John André, the head of British intelligence. Others believe she moved among the drawing rooms of loyalist families, listening carefully, never revealing her true purpose. What is clear is that her reports contained insights that could not have been gleaned from a distance, details about troop movements, morale, and plans. The process by which these fragments of knowledge travelled to Washington was painstaking. A message might begin as a conversation overheard in a candlelit parlour. That information would be memorized or jotted in cipher on a scrap of paper. A courier would collect the note, sometimes concealed in the heel of a shoe or sewn into the lining of a coat. The journey across Long Island Sound in a small boat was always dangerous. British patrols searched vessels at random. Any sign of subterfuge could mean imprisonment or worse. Yet week after week these messages arrived at the American camp. Washington himself was careful never to compromise the identities of his agents. In his letters he referred to them only by their code names. He understood that their usefulness and their survival depended on secrecy. Some historians have speculated that Agent 355 provided critical intelligence about Benedict Arnold, the American general, who had secretly agreed to betray the revolutionary cause. Arnold's defection, if successful, could have handed the fortress at West Point to the British, a blow from which the Continental Army might not have recovered. It was Major André who was captured carrying documents revealing the plot. Whether Agent 355's information contributed to that outcome remains uncertain, but the timing suggests she may have played a role. If she did, she never claimed credit. The world she inhabited required a kind of quiet courage that has always been harder to recognize than the bravery of the battlefield. A soldier may be decorated for valor, but those who labor in the shadows receive few commendations. Their victories are measured in the things that do not happen. The attacks averted the ambushes that never materialize. I sometimes imagine Agent 355 pausing in a dark hallway listening for footsteps. Perhaps she carried a folded letter inside her sleeve, pressing her arm to her side so it would not slip free. In that moment she would have known that discovery would not simply bring danger to herself, it would have endangered her family, her friends, her entire community. And still, she continued. It is a peculiarity of human history that those who do the most decisive work are often those least remembered. The Culper ring operated for 5 years, gathering intelligence, passing messages, making possible the strategies that would eventually lead to independence. When the war ended, the network dissolved. Some members resumed the lives they had left behind. Their names were revealed only in fragments as letters and diaries surfaced decades later. But Agent 355 remained a mystery. No one ever stepped forward to say, "It was me." Perhaps she died before the war was done. Some accounts claim she was arrested and taken aboard a British prison ship where conditions were so harsh that many captives never left alive. Others believe she survived and simply chose never to tell. In the end, it is the silence that endures. Her code name, so simple, so impersonal, was the only marker of her passage through history. But behind those numbers was a woman of flesh and thought and determination. Someone who believed that a cause worth risking everything for might also be a cause worth remaining anonymous for. As you rest, you may find it comforting to consider that much of what has shaped the world was carried out by people whose names are lost to time. Their sacrifices did not depend on recognition. Their purpose was not glory, but service. In the next part of this story, we will look more closely at the way the Culper ring created and maintained their codes, and the ingenious techniques that allowed messages to pass undetected under the noses of the British command. For now, you can simply let your thoughts drift across that distance of centuries. Picture a quiet room, a woman sealing an envelope and a single candle flickering against the darkness. When you read about Agent 355, you will quickly discover that she exists only in fragments like a figure glimpsed at the edge of a lantern's glow. There is no single account that names her, no definitive letter signed in her own hand. What remains is a puzzle of clues, ciphers, brief mentions, and reports recollections passed from one generation to the next. It is this incompleteness that makes her story feel all the more human. In the coded correspondence of the Culper ring, the designation 355 was used more than once. Sometimes it referred to information coming from a woman, sometimes it may have referred to the same woman repeatedly. The number itself was derived from a simple numeric cipher 355 translated to lady, and yet over the years the repetition of that number took on a weight beyond its literal meaning. It became a symbol of a particular figure, a woman who, though unnamed, was believed to have been essential to the intelligence gathered in New York. Historians have spent decades trying to determine who she might have been. Some suggest that she was Anna Strong, the Long Island woman whose laundry signals guided couriers. Anna's role in the Culper ring is well documented, but whether she was ever designated 355 remains uncertain. Others point to Sarah Townsend, the daughter of a loyalist tavern owner. Sarah's family operated a popular gathering place for British officers, and it is said she listened quietly while they discussed troop movements over glasses of brandy. She may have passed what she heard to Robert Townsend Culper Jr., who then encoded the reports for Washington. Still others believe Agent 355 was a woman of no particular social standing, a maid or servant whose presence was so ordinary that no one thought to question her. That after all was the great advantage of being invisible to blend into the background so completely that even those who depended on you never noticed you were there. No matter which theory you find most plausible, it is worth remembering that each one rests on limited evidence. The Culper ring was designed to leave as few traces as possible. Even George Washington was careful never to write down the names of those who carried out the most sensitive tasks. In one letter, Washington noted simply that the intelligence coming from New York had been of singular utility. He did not say who had gathered it. This reticence was not an oversight. It was a matter of survival. To name Agent 355 would have been to expose her to discovery. Should the letters be intercepted, any detail could mean arrest or execution, and so she remained in the language of the time a lady unknown. As the war continued, her contributions, whatever their specifics, were folded into the broader work of the Culper ring. Reports were compiled, encoded, and dispatched to Washington's headquarters. Each message was read with care, and decisions were made that would shape the future of the revolution. And yet, somewhere between the arrival of a letter and the victory it made possible, her part in it slipped into obscurity. When you consider the few surviving details, you might wonder why so much effort has been devoted to uncovering her name. After all, countless men and women performed anonymous acts of service during the war. Countless lives were changed or ended without record. But perhaps the fascination with Agent 355 lies in what she represents: the idea that even in an age dominated by declarations and battlefields, there was room for quieter forms of courage. Her story suggests that history is not only the sum of great speeches and military triumphs, it is also the accumulation of small hidden efforts that no one applauds. I sometimes imagine her standing in a corridor lined with polished wood, waiting for the right moment to slip away. Perhaps she carried a tray of empty glasses moving between officers who never suspected that the woman passing behind them held knowledge that could undo their plans. Or perhaps she was simply a face glimpsed in a doorway, someone who appeared for a moment and then vanished. Whatever the truth, it is clear that her work required more than discretion. It required a willingness to stake everything: freedom, reputation, life itself, on the hope that her efforts would matter. When I think of her, I'm reminded that some contributions are so deeply woven into the fabric of events that they can never be teased free. We do not know her name, and we may never know, but that does not lessen the value of what she did. In the years after the Revolution, as the new United States struggled to define itself, the stories of men like Washington and Jefferson became the stuff of legend. Their names were set in stone, their portraits hung in halls of government. By contrast, the names of those who laboured in the shadows were often lost to the passing of time. Agent 355 became, in the decades that followed, an echo, a figure invoked in footnotes and half-remembered anecdotes. Still, her legend persisted. Even now, her story is told and retold, adapted in novels and dramatised in television series. Each retelling adds a layer of speculation, a new theory to be debated. But beneath all the invention, there remains the same essential fact: there was a woman once who risked everything to serve a cause she believed in. As you listen, you may find it comforting to consider how many others like her have passed through history unrecognised. In every generation there have been those who preferred the quiet satisfaction of doing necessary work to the noisy pursuit of fame. If you're growing drowsy, you can let your mind wander through these small details: the code numbers, the flickering candles, the folded letters carried across dark water. In the next part of this story, we will explore the lives of other women who served as spies, and how their contributions, like Agent 355's, were shaped by the expectations and limitations of their time. For now, you can rest in the knowledge that even the most hidden lives can leave a lasting mark. When we think of espionage, it is often in the language of intrigue-coded messages, secret meetings, and elaborate disguises. The very word spy can summon images of hidden compartments and whispered betrayals. Yet for the women who carried out such work during the American Revolution, their reality was often far simpler, and in some ways far more dangerous. They did not have the protection of rank or uniform. Many were mothers, daughters, and wives whose movements were assumed to be harmless. This presumption of innocence, born of the time's expectations about a woman's role, sometimes offered them a peculiar advantage. But it also meant that if they were discovered, there would be no official recognition, no exchange as prisoners of war. They would be tried as criminals traitors to the crown and punished without ceremony. In this way, the quiet labour of women spies carried a burden that was both practical and moral. To serve the revolutionary cause was to stake everything on an uncertain outcome. To do so as a woman was to navigate a world in which your presence was often discounted, even as your actions might prove decisive. Among the most frequently cited examples of female espionage is Anna Strong, whose home in Setauket, Long Island, became a point of contact for the Culper ring. According to later accounts, Anna used her laundry as a signal system. When a black petticoat appeared on her clothesline, it meant a message was ready. The number of white handkerchiefs told the courier where to collect it. The image is almost domestic in its simplicity: laundry, fluttering in the wind, a woman going about her chores. Yet hidden in that ordinary scene was an act of profound risk. Anna's status as a respectable wife and mother did not shield her from suspicion. If the British had uncovered the meaning of her signals, she could have been arrested, her family's property seized. That she continued anyway speaks to the conviction that even in the face of overwhelming power, small acts of defiance mattered. Other women whose names have not survived carried messages on horseback or by foot. They listened at the edges of conversations and repeated what they heard to those who could make sense of it. One can imagine the fear that must have accompanied such errands, the knowledge that a single mistake could undo not only your own safety, but the plans of many others. There is in these stories a quiet insistence on the dignity of ordinary people. Most were not formally trained. They were not soldiers or diplomats. They were neighbours and friends who found themselves in the middle of a conflict they did not begin but felt compelled to help resolve. Sometimes their participation was a matter of conviction. Other times it arose from necessity, a desire to protect their communities to resist the disruptions of war that had upended the patterns of daily life. The Revolutionary War was not merely a contest of armies. It was a struggle fought in the kitchens and parlours of occupied towns, in the hidden compartments of carriages, in the folded corners of letters, passed discreetly from hand to hand. In such a climate, a woman could be both unremarkable and essential. It is tempting now to imagine these women as a single cohesive network, working in perfect coordination with one another, but in truth their efforts were often improvised, reliant on trust and instinct as much as any plan. Communication was slow. Messages might take days or weeks to reach their destination. A courier delayed by weather or illness could upend an entire sequence of carefully arranged contacts. And yet, despite these challenges, the work continued. One reason it endured was the understanding that the struggle for independence would be long, and that no single victory would secure it. The British were well organised and well funded. They believed that time was on their side, that eventually the colonies would exhaust their will to resist. For women engaged in espionage, this meant that their tasks were often repetitive. A signal raised a message, carried a report transcribed. No moment of triumph declared the work complete. Each success was provisional, requiring new efforts to sustain it. I find something quietly admirable in this patience. To persist in such conditions requires a faith in purpose that does not depend on immediate reward. If Agent 355 was indeed one of these women, an operator who used her presence in social circles to gather intelligence, then her story belongs within this broader context. She would have known that her efforts might never be acknowledged. She would have known that her identity would be protected even from her own allies. And she would have known that discovery could mean the end of everything she valued. Still, she continued. Some accounts suggest that she had access to British officers' households, perhaps even to Major John André himself. If this is true, she must have carried herself with a composure that deflected suspicion. She must have learned to listen without appearing to listen, to remember details without betraying interest. Imagine her at a gathering, perhaps a dinner where the conversation turned to troop movements. Candles flickered on polished wood. A string quartet played in a neighbouring room. All around her, the business of occupation proceeded with an air of normalcy. Yet beneath the polite exchanges and measured toasts, she heard the things that mattered: the names of regiments, the dates of departures, the hints of alliances not yet revealed. Later she would recall those fragments and set them down in coded form. She might have done so at a small desk by lamplight, pausing to be sure no one approached. Each letter committed to paper was another risk assumed, another act of faith that someone on the other end would know how to read and use it. And then, as the candle burned low, she would seal the note and prepare to pass it along the invisible chain that led in time to George Washington himself. There is something about this image, a woman alone in the dark writing what she could not say aloud, that feels both intimate and resolute. It is perhaps this tension between vulnerability and strength that makes her story linger. In the next part of our story, we will look more closely at what it meant to live behind enemy lines, the small routines that sustained a hidden life, the moments of fear and the quiet determination that carried her through them. As you listen, you can let these images settle in your thoughts, like the soft rustle of a curtain drawn against the night. For now, you need not remember every name or date. It is enough to know that in the quiet places of history there were always those who chose to act even when no one would ever see them clearly. To live behind enemy lines is to dwell in a state of careful watchfulness, a posture that never quite relaxes no matter how familiar the streets may seem. For Agent 355 and the others who moved quietly through British-held New York, the routines of daily life were layered with hidden purpose. In the morning, the city woke to the same sounds it had always known: the clatter of carts on cobblestones, the cries of vendors selling bread and cloth, the tolling of church bells. But beneath that familiar surface was the constant awareness that each word spoken and each gesture observed could be reported, that every acquaintance might be more than they appeared. New York under occupation was in many respects a city divided against itself. There were those who remained loyal to the British Crown, convinced that any rebellion would eventually be suppressed. They dined with officers, sold goods to the army, and carried letters to London. They had much to gain by demonstrating their allegiance. There were also those who supported the cause of independence but could not flee to the countryside or join the Continental Army. Their homes, their livelihoods, and their families were rooted in the city. For them, each day required small accommodations, a polite nod to a British patrol, a carefully measured answer to an unwelcome question. Some tried to remain neutral, to survive the conflict by offering no sign of preference. But neutrality was itself a kind of risk, for suspicion flourished in the spaces where certainty was absent. In this environment, Agent 355 would have learned to adopt a bearing that revealed nothing. Perhaps she was known as a woman of few words. Perhaps she smiled when appropriate and inquired about the health of neighbours, all while listening for fragments of conversation that might prove useful. Her tasks were never recorded in detail. No ledger lists the days she spent gathering information, no diary preserves her reflections. But if you close your eyes, you might imagine the rhythm of her life days spent in the company of people who would have condemned her without hesitation, evenings spent transcribing what she had learned by the light of a single candle. There is a peculiar quiet in such a life. To keep secrets is to become in a sense divided from yourself. One part of you must always remain alert, assessing the dangers of each encounter. Another part must appear composed and unremarkable, offering no hint of the thoughts you carry. It is possible that Agent 355 came to inhabit this duality so completely that it no longer felt unnatural. Over time, she may have learned to slip between roles as easily as drawing a curtain one moment, the attentive observer the next, the neighbour with nothing to conceal. The British authorities were not unaware that spies moved among them. They knew that their plans had been betrayed, that letters had been read by eyes they had not accounted for, and so they too watched. They questioned those whose names appeared too often in the wrong company. They detained couriers and searched belongings. From time to time a spy was discovered and made an example of. These arrests were public warnings, evidence that no act of treachery would go unpunished. But each time one network was broken, another seemed to arise in its place, like a vine that once cut sent out new shoots. In the case of Agent 355, the records are silent on whether she was ever suspected, whether she endured the anxiety of questioning or the terror of imprisonment. Some later accounts suggest that she was eventually captured and held aboard a prison ship anchored in New York Harbour. These ships, known as hulks, were once vessels of commerce stripped of their rigging and converted into floating jails. Conditions on board were harsh. Prisoners were crowded below decks where air was foul and disease spread quickly. Food was scarce, and the sick were often left unattended. For many, captivity there meant an unmarked grave in the harbour's shallows. If Agent 355 met such a fate, no record survives to tell it plainly. All that remains is the rumour that a woman known by no name was held in the darkness and never returned. And yet this possibility is only one among several. It may be that she survived the war, returned to an ordinary life, and never revealed the truth of what she had done. It may be that her story was deliberately obscured, a precaution that succeeded so well that even those who sought to honour her memory could find no trace. Whatever the ending, the fact of her presence, the knowledge that she moved through that occupied city with purpose, remains a quiet testament to her resolve. Behind enemy lines, each day brought small decisions. Was it safe to deliver a message? Was it wiser to wait? Could a passing remark be trusted, or was it meant to test loyalty? Such questions cannot be answered in retrospect. They are the measure of a life lived in the grey spaces between certainty and doubt. I sometimes think of her returning home at the end of such a day. Perhaps she set aside her notes and folded her hands in her lap, allowing herself a single unguarded moment. Perhaps she looked at the flame of her candle and wondered whether any of it would be remembered. It is possible that she did not care. In the economy of secret work, the doing of the task is often all that matters. Recognition is a luxury, sometimes even a liability. For Agent 355 and others like her, the satisfaction lay in knowing that their efforts, anonymous though they were, had helped to shape events greater than themselves. Tonight as you rest, you can allow these images to settle gently in your thoughts. The narrow streets of New York beneath British banners, the hush of a hidden room, the steady hand of a woman writing by candlelight. In the next part of our story, we will explore the ways secrets were carried in silence, the methods by which messages travelled from one hidden hand to the next, and the quiet ingenuity that allowed such fragile knowledge to survive. For now, you need only remember that behind every confident declaration of history lies a network of small, unrecorded acts, and somewhere among them a woman known only as 355 carried her purpose through the darkness. To imagine how secrets travelled during the American Revolution, you must picture a world without the conveniences we take for granted. There was no telegraph to flash messages across a continent. In moments, no telephone to whisper warnings to a distant ally. News moved at the speed of a horse, a boat, or a human step, and each mile carried the possibility of failure. In that slow economy of information, even the smallest note was precious. A scrap of paper folded into a seam could mean the difference between victory and disaster. To carry it was to become, however, briefly a custodian of a fragile hope. The men and women who conveyed these messages had to trust in their own caution. They knew that no cipher was unbreakable, no ruse entirely safe. Each method they devised was a shield with cracks, and the work of the enemy was to find and exploit them. Some messages were hidden in the hollow shafts of quill pens, the ink cleaned away so a tiny roll of paper could be slipped inside. Other couriers used small wooden cylinders carved to fit precisely inside a boot heel. A search might reveal nothing but the ordinary signs of travel, a bundle of clothes, a few coins, while the true cargo remained invisible. In other instances, the message itself was hidden in plain sight. A letter describing the price of wool or the condition of the weather might, to the initiated, contain information about troop movements or planned offensives. This concealment relied on ciphers, simple substitutions of letters and numbers, or more elaborate systems that required a key known only to a handful of trusted hands. Among the Culper ring, one method stood out for its quiet ingenuity. They used invisible ink derived from substances as ordinary as ghoul nuts or lemon juice. When applied to paper, the writing disappeared as it dried. Only by brushing the page with heat, a candle held carefully beneath, or a warm iron would the hidden lines emerge again. It is easy to imagine the tension of this process. A courier seated in the back of a modest house holding a page over a flickering flame. The words appearing slowly as if summoned by incantation names, dates, signals. All of it written in a hand that might belong to anyone, and yet known to be the work of a friend or a stranger whose loyalty was unproven. The woman we call Agent 355 would have understood these risks intimately. Whether she penned her reports herself or passed information to others, she knew that each link in the chain was a potential point of failure. The reliability of a courier, the vigilance of a guard, the happenstance of a patrol's timing, any of these could scatter months of labour like ash. And yet the messages kept moving. They moved in the linings of cloaks, in the hollow handles of baskets, in the seams of hats. They moved in coded phrases committed to memory by those who had learned to remember every word even when no written record was safe. Consider for a moment what it must have felt like to carry such knowledge. A slip of paper in a sleeve could be no heavier than a feather, but in the mind it weighed so much more. At any moment, an encounter on the road, a question asked too casually, could bring everything to an end. Still, these couriers persisted, not because they believed themselves invulnerable, but because they believed the cause required it. Each journey across Long Island Sound, each passage through occupied streets was a small act of defiance, a statement that no empire, however mighty, could know everything. The routes themselves were familiar, yet treacherous. A courier might leave Manhattan before dawn, passing British sentries who waved him through with a nod. By midday he would reach the shore where a small boat waited in the reeds. The crossing to Connecticut was cold and uncertain, the wind sometimes carrying the smell of gunpowder from distant skirmishes. On the far shore another hand waited to receive what had been carried. A brief exchange, no more than a nod or a whispered word, and the message continued on its way, inching closer to the waiting eyes of Washington's staff. Agent 355's role in this network was likely more than passive. The specificity of the intelligence attributed to her suggests that she was trusted to discern what was important and what was merely rumour. She would have listened carefully, filtering idle boasts and careless speculation to find the small truths that could be turned into strategy. There is a discipline in that kind of listening, a patience that does not announce itself, a mind that can hold contradiction without rushing to judgment. When you imagine her at work, you might see a woman seated quietly in a crowded parlour, her expression composed as voices rose and fell around her. She did not need to ask many questions. She only needed to remember. Sometimes no words at all were required. A gesture, a tone, a glance exchanged between officers could reveal more than a page of declarations. And when she returned home, she would recall each detail, arranging them in her thoughts, until the pattern became clear. To live in this way is to exist always at the edge of exposure. One mistake, a wrong turn, an overheard confidence shared with the wrong person, could shatter the careful illusion of ordinariness. Yet without that risk, no knowledge could be gained. It is difficult now to grasp the courage such work demanded. We read these accounts in the safety of hindsight, knowing that the war would end, that independence would be won. But to those who carried the messages, nothing was certain. Every crossing of the Sound, every encoded letter was an admission that failure was possible. Even in failure, though, there was meaning. To stand against the machinery of empire with nothing but conviction and secrecy was in its way a quiet declaration of sovereignty. Tonight, as you rest, you may find it comforting to imagine these journeys, the small boats moving through fog, the couriers huddled against the wind, the woman with a folded letter pressed to her palm, each of them unknown to one another, part of a network that depended on the simplest of human capacities, trust. In the next part of our story, we will turn to the successes of this hidden labour, the moments when messages arrived in time when plans were made or altered, because someone had carried a secret across the darkness. Until then, you need not hold every detail in your mind. It is enough to know that in the spaces between battles, in the quiet hours before dawn, history was shaped by those who chose to act without recognition. And somewhere among them, Agent 355 waited, listening and carrying what she knew in silence. When we look back on the years of the American Revolution, we tend to remember the battles Bunker Hill and Saratoga, Yorktown and Trenton. But so many of the turning points were not fought with cannon or musket. They unfolded in letters that arrived at the right moment in warnings delivered by those whose names would never be recorded in official dispatches. The Culper Ring, with all its small, careful efforts, became one of the most effective intelligence networks of the war. It was not a grand organisation. It had no uniforms or flags, but it did what armies alone could not. It gathered knowledge from behind the lines and brought it quietly into Washington's hands. One of the most significant achievements of the Ring was the exposure of Benedict Arnold's treachery. Arnold, once a hero of the Continental cause, had grown disillusioned and resentful. He believed he was insufficiently honoured for his sacrifices and embittered by financial hardship. Over time, he began to see defection not as betrayal, but as a means of securing his future. While Arnold negotiated with the British Major John André, became his principal contact. André was charming and clever, known for his sophistication and his ability to inspire trust. He was exactly the kind of man who could slip between roles an officer and a gentleman, and at the same time a spy master. It was in this climate of hidden ambitions that the intelligence gathered by the Culper Ring proved invaluable. Reports of Arnold's discontent and his covert meetings began to reach Washington, in pieces, each fragment too small to prove anything on its own. But together, they suggested that something dangerous was unfolding. Some historians believe Agent 355 played a part in gathering these pieces. She may have learned of André's presence in New York social circles, of the messages passed discreetly between his quarters and the hands of loyalist intermediaries. Perhaps she observed the growing familiarity between André and certain American officers whose loyalties were wavering. Even if her role was not singular, it was likely essential. Information was often confirmed by multiple sources, each unaware of the others. A rumour overheard at a dinner could be tested against a report smuggled in from Long Island. Patterns emerged sometimes slowly, like a shape taking form in fog. In September of 1780, the British plot came to a head. André, travelling under a false name, carried papers that detailed Arnold's plan to surrender West Point, one of the most strategic positions on the Hudson River. If the British had captured it, the American cause might have been fatally divided. André was captured near Tarrytown, searched, and found to be carrying incriminating documents hidden in his boot. He was arrested as a spy, and the evidence he carried confirmed what so many in Washington Circle had begun to suspect. Arnold, warned in time, fled to the British side, where he was given rank and payment but never fully trusted. André, less fortunate, was tried and hanged. This episode, dramatic though it seems now, was only possible because of countless quiet acts that came before it. The reports gathered in parlours and taverns, the letters carried across water in the dark, the conversations that were recalled in perfect detail and committed to cipher. It is worth remembering that most of those who contributed to this discovery never saw a battlefield. They did not ride in triumph or stand in the glow of public gratitude. Their work ended as it began, in silence. The exposure of Arnold's plot was the most famous but not the only success of the Culper ring. Over the course of the war, they delivered intelligence on British troop deployments, naval movements, and the state of supplies. Sometimes their reports allowed Washington to avoid an ambush. Sometimes they provided just enough insight to time a maneuver or press an advantage. Each message, however small, was a fragment of a larger understanding. It was the accumulation of these fragments that sustained the cause when material resources were scarce. One can imagine Washington seated by lamplight studying a newly arrived letter. Perhaps he read it once, then again, weighing each sentence against what he already knew. In those moments, the vast machinery of war was reduced to the simple intimacy of two people, one who risked everything to send a truth, and one who decided what must be done with it. For the couriers and informants, there was no certainty that their efforts would bear fruit. A letter might arrive too late to matter or be dismissed as rumour, yet they persisted week after week because the alternative to remain passive was unthinkable. Agent 355, in whatever form her work took, was part of this persistence. Though we cannot say precisely which reports bear her signature, we can be certain that her willingness to remain anonymous did not mean her influence was lessened. That perhaps is the most enduring lesson of her story. The measure of contribution is not always the recognition it receives. Sometimes it is the quiet knowledge that you have done what you could even if no one ever speaks your name. Tonight you may find it reassuring to consider how many turning points in history have been shaped not by declarations and ceremonies, but by unseen hands carrying small secrets. These were the hands that turned the course of battles, the hands that preserved the fragile hope of independence. In the next part of our story, we'll look more closely at the personal cost of such a life, the strain of constant caution, the burden of never being able to say aloud what you had done. Until then, you can let your thoughts drift among these details, the rustle of a coded letter, folded into a pocket, the hush of a hidden room, the knowledge that somewhere someone was listening carefully and writing everything down. And in that listening, a revolution found the means to survive. If there is a single event that draws together the threads of secrecy, ambition, and quiet peril, in the story of the Culper ring, it is the capture of Major John André. His name appears again and again in accounts of the Revolution's most precarious moments, and though he belonged to the British cause, his fate was woven inseparably with the efforts of those who worked in shadows. Major André was not a man easily overlooked. He was young, intelligent, and fluent in the codes and courtesies of the European military tradition. Even his American captors, when the time came, spoke of his dignity and composure. But he was above all else a symbol of the lengths to which the British command would go to end the rebellion. To understand why his capture mattered so much, you have to imagine what it meant to hold West Point. Perched above the Hudson River, the fortress commanded a critical passage that split the colonies north to south. If the British had secured it, they could have choked the rebellion's communication and supply lines, isolating New England from the southern colonies. Benedict Arnold, embittered and resentful, had agreed to hand West Point over in exchange for money and rank. For the British, the promise was too tempting to refuse. For the Americans, the danger was almost beyond calculation. Somewhere amid this intrigue, the information gathered by the Culper ring began to find its way into Washington's awareness. Reports suggested that Arnold was discontent and might be in communication with British officers. Other rumours hinted that something decisive was being planned. Though no surviving document links Agent 355 directly to the final intelligence that unmasked Arnold's betrayal, many believe she played a role in confirming the pattern, offering small, precise observations that made it impossible to dismiss the threat as idle gossip. It was in late September of 1780 that André set out to conclude his arrangement with Arnold. Travelling under a false name, he carried the details of the plan in his boot map's notes, and a pass signed by Arnold himself to ease his passage through American lines. But fate indifferent to schemes intervened. As André made his way south along the Hudson, he was stopped near Tarrytown by 3 American militiamen, John Paulding, Isaac Van Wart, and David Williams. They had no orders to search for spies. They were simply patrolling a road that had seen much illicit trade. Yet when they challenged André, something in his manner convinced them to search him. They found the papers hidden in his boot, and understood at once that they were holding a man whose purpose reached far beyond any petty smuggling. He was taken into custody, and the documents were dispatched to higher command. In the hours that followed, word reached Benedict Arnold. Realising the plot was lost, he fled to the British side, leaving behind his wife and the garrison he had been prepared to betray. André, meanwhile, was delivered to American headquarters. There he was questioned and treated by most accounts with a respect that mingled curiosity and regret. Even Washington, who could not afford sentiment, is said to have felt a reluctant admiration for the young officer's composure. It is in these moments, when the drama of espionage becomes intensely human, that the story finds its quiet gravity. André knew he would be tried as a spy rather than a soldier. He knew the penalty. Still, he conducted himself with courtesy, and in the end with an unshakable dignity. His trial was swift. The evidence carried in his own hand left no room for doubt. He was condemned to hang. On the morning of October 2, 1780, André was led to the gallows. Witnesses said he walked calmly to the scaffold, asked that he not be blindfolded, and arranged the noose himself. He died as he had lived, with the bearing of a man who believed in his cause even if it had betrayed him. If you close your eyes, you might imagine the hush that settled over the crowd as the rope tightened. There would have been no applause, no triumphant exclamation, just the uneasy understanding that the revolution was in every sense a conflict fought in shadows as much as in open fields. For Agent 355 and others like her, the capture of André was proof that their labour, invisible though it remained, had consequences. Information whispered across a table or hidden in a letter could bring down the ambitions of the powerful. It could alter the course of a war. In later years, romantic stories would attach themselves to André and Arnold alike. Plays and novels recast the events as dramas of personal rivalry and tragic loyalty. But beneath the embellishments was a simpler truth. Without the patient accumulation of intelligence, without the people willing to risk everything to learn what others wished hidden, none of it would have been possible. For the Culper ring, this success was not a moment to celebrate openly. No medals were awarded, no proclamations named those responsible. Secrecy remained their shield and their burden. Agent 355, if she contributed to the downfall of Benedict Arnold's plan, likely learned of it only indirectly. Perhaps she heard the whispers that André had been caught. Perhaps she saw in the wary glances exchanged by British officers that something irrevocable had taken place. And then, as she had before, she would have returned to her work, listening, remembering, carrying secrets through a city that grew more tense with each passing month. Tonight you can let these images drift through your thoughts: the patrol on a quiet road, the folded papers hidden in a boot, the young officer standing alone beneath the wide sky. You need not judge any of them. You need not decide who was right and who was wrong. It is enough to see that in these small, decisive moments, the hidden work of ordinary people changed the shape of history. In the next part of this story, we will consider the personal cost of that hidden work, the toll it took on those who carried it, and the silences that remained long after the war was over. For now, you may find comfort in the thought that even the most secret lives leave traces. And somewhere among the names we know, and the many we never will, a woman known only as 355 continued her quiet vigil. When you spend enough time with the histories of those who worked in secret, a certain pattern begins to emerge. The details change the names, the causes, the flags under which they laboured, but the cost is often the same. It is a cost measured not only in danger or hardship, but in the gradual erosion of ordinary life. For Agent 355 and for others like her, each day behind enemy lines was shaped by uncertainty. There was no guarantee that the cause they served would prevail. There was no promise that their sacrifices would be acknowledged. There was only the quiet conviction that their efforts mattered, even if no one ever said so aloud. Imagine, if you will, the weight of that conviction. To rise each morning knowing that everything you did had to be measured against the risk of exposure. To share a table with neighbours or acquaintances who, if they knew the truth, might see you as a traitor to their king, or worse, as an enemy to be denounced. In occupied New York, the division between loyalty and rebellion was not always clear. Families were split in their sympathies. Friends found themselves on opposite sides sometimes without knowing it. A chance remark could be enough to mark a person as suspect. Against this backdrop, the life of a spy was often one of solitude. It was not merely that Agent 355 had to keep her secrets from her enemies. She had to keep them from nearly everyone, her family, her friends, perhaps even those who worked beside her in other parts of the Culper ring. This solitude left its mark. Though the records do not tell us how she felt, you can imagine the strain of carrying knowledge she could never share. Each success could not be celebrated openly. Each narrow escape could not be confessed. In the silence that followed every mission, there must have been moments when she questioned whether the price was worth paying. Historians sometimes note that espionage in this era required less of the elaborate disguises we associate with later centuries, and more of a steady temperament. The ideal operative was someone who could pass unnoticed, not by virtue of clever costumes, but by embodying ordinariness so completely that no one would think to look closer. To become that invisible presence was in its way a discipline. It meant setting aside any wish for recognition. It meant accepting that even the people you helped might never know your name. Yet there was also something sustaining in that discipline. The work itself repetitive and quiet as it was offered a sense of purpose. For all its risks, it allowed those who engaged in it to feel that they were contributing to something larger than themselves. One can imagine Agent 355 finding moments of calm in the repetition, the familiar motions of preparing a message, the steady rhythm of footsteps along a known route, the small satisfaction of seeing a signal acknowledged. Even in the most uncertain times, routine can offer its own fragile comfort. But there were costs that routine could not erase. The constant need for vigilance made true relaxation impossible. Every encounter carried a question: had she said too much? Had she been seen in the wrong company? Had she left any clue that might be pieced together by those who searched for traitors? Over time, this watchfulness becomes its own burden. It is not a single moment of fear, but a continuous undercurrent, a tension that hums through every gesture, every conversation, every breath. Some stories suggest that Agent 355 was eventually captured, that she was taken to one of the prison ships anchored in New York Harbor. These ships were grim places where the sick and the condemned were crowded into damp holds with little food or medical care. If she was indeed imprisoned there, her final days would have been marked by the same quiet endurance that defined her work. There would have been no audience to witness her courage, no record to preserve her words. And yet, even if she died unknown, her actions had already shaped events far beyond her own life. This is perhaps the hardest truth about those who labour in secret. Their sacrifices are often invisible even in the moment they are made. When a courier reached Washington's headquarters, with a coded report, no one knew the names of every hand that had passed it along. When a plan was averted or an ambush was avoided, there was no roll call to thank each contributor. For those who risked everything, the only certainty was that they might never be remembered. But if you look closely, you will find traces of them all the same. In the letters that survived by accident, in the fragmentary accounts recorded years later, in the changes that unfolded quietly because of something learned in a candlelit room. Agent 355's story is a reminder that history is often shaped by those who ask for nothing in return. Their courage is not measured in parades or monuments, but in the steady commitment to do what is necessary. Tonight, as you let your thoughts drift towards sleep, you can reflect on that kind of courage. The quiet, persistent kind that does not announce itself, but that leaves the world altered in small, irrevocable ways. In the next part of our story, we will explore the theories and legends that have grown up around her name, the questions that historians still debate, and the possibilities that remain tantalizingly unresolved. For now, it is enough to rest in the knowledge that some lives matter precisely because they were lived without applause. In that silence, you may find something peaceful, the understanding that to do good need not require recognition, only conviction, and so she carried hers through every uncertain day until the end. When a life is left mostly unrecorded, it becomes an invitation. Into the spaces where facts should be, we place our questions, our hopes, and our need to find meaning in the unknown. So it is with Agent 355. Her story, fragmentary and quiet, has grown over the centuries into something larger than the traces she left behind. Historians have argued over her identity, offering theories that reflect not only evidence, but imagination. Writers have reimagined her as heroine martyr, or even myth. And somewhere among these possibilities, the woman herself waits in silence. One of the earliest and most enduring theories names Anna Strong as Agent 355. Anna was a Long Island resident whose husband had been imprisoned by the British. Her home became a safe harbour for messages moving between Culper operatives and the couriers who carried them across Long Island Sound. Her role is among the best documented in the Culper network. The story of her clothes line used to signal when a message was ready has appeared in countless retellings. Those who believe Anna was 355 argue that her proximity to critical exchanges and her status as a known patriot made her the most likely candidate. Yet others point out that while Anna Strong's work was indispensable, it is not clear she ever moved in the social circles that would have allowed her to overhear the high-level information attributed to Agent 355. Her signals were bold but simple, more likely part of a broader system than the sole channel for intelligence. Another possibility centres on Sarah Townsend, whose family operated a tavern in Oyster Bay frequented by British officers. Sarah was educated and observant. She's said to have listened carefully to the conversations that passed over her father's tables, gathering details about troop movements and strategy. Proponents of this theory note that the Townsend family had ties to Robert Townsend Culper Jr., who played a central role in the network. If Sarah passed information to her relative, it would have been folded naturally into the reports that reached Washington. A third theory, one that appeals to many for its elegant simplicity, suggests that Agent 355 was no single woman at all. Instead, the number 355 may have been a general designation applied to any female informant whose identity needed to remain hidden. Under this interpretation, she is at once many women, and none of them in particular a symbol rather than a single life. This idea has its own quiet power. It reminds us that in every conflict there are countless participants who leave no individual record. Their efforts blend into a collective impact. Their names dissolve into the cause they served. For some historians, this lack of certainty is frustrating. The instinct to catalogue, to confirm, to set down in ink what happened, and to whom is strong. But there is another way to look at it, a way that feels gentler and perhaps more true to the spirit of those who laboured in secret. To remain unknown is not always a loss. Sometimes it is a choice, a protection, an acknowledgement that the work itself was more important than the person who did it. In the decades after the revolution ended, America turned its attention to the work of building a nation. New governments were formed, new conflicts arose, and the memory of the war receded into monuments and textbooks. The names of generals and politicians were etched in marble. Their likenesses were captured in portraits and statues. But the stories of those who carried messages, who listened when no one suspected, who risked their safety in the hope of a future they might not see, those stories remained in the shadows. From time to time, a letter would surface. A memoir would hint at unnamed helpers. An old family story would offer a tantalizing clue. Yet none of these fragments was enough to close the circle. Perhaps it is better this way. To know everything is to strip away the mystery that reminds us how much depends on unseen hands. In more recent times, the figure of Agent 355 has inspired novels and television series. In these adaptations, she is often portrayed as a singular heroic figure, a young woman whose courage and intelligence outwitted the most powerful army in the world. The details vary. Sometimes she's a well-born lady moving through drawing rooms in fine clothes. Sometimes she's a servant unnoticed by those who believe themselves above her. These stories may not be strictly accurate, but they serve another purpose. They keep alive the sense that history is not only made by the famous, it is also shaped by those whose names we do not know, who laboured without recognition, and whose quiet actions tip the balance at critical moments. When you think of Agent 355, you might imagine her any way you wish. Perhaps she wore the modest dress of a tradesman's wife. Perhaps she moved among British officers with practiced composure. Perhaps she never stepped foot in the circles of power, and instead passed her information by way of another, whose trust she earned through steady kindness. What matters is not which of these images is true. What matters is that she existed. that she chose to do what she could in the time and place she was given, and that the world is different because of it. As you let these possibilities drift through your mind, you may find it comforting to consider how many lives are shaped by the unseen. We are accustomed to thinking of history as the sum of great speeches and decisive battles, but it is also composed of quiet decisions made in unremarkable rooms. In the next part of this story, we will turn to the legacy of Agent 355, the ways her example has endured, and the lessons that remain for those who come after. For now, you need not be certain of every fact. You can let the uncertainty itself become a kind of stillness, a reminder that even when the record is incomplete, the truth of devotion and purpose is never truly lost. In the long war for independence, George Washington came to rely on more than regiments and battalions. He learned that the difference between success and failure could rest on a single sheet of paper, folded into a courier's pocket, carried across dark water, delivered at the hour when doubt threatened to overwhelm resolve. Washington was not by nature a man of sentiment, nor was he quick to offer praise. His letters were measured, his public statements cautious. Yet again and again he expressed in restrained words how much he valued the flow of intelligence that came to him from occupied New York. He called the Culper ring singularly useful. He thanked them in language that was formal, almost understated, as if he knew that to say too much would endanger those whose safety depended on anonymity. And so the gratitude he offered was often the only reward the network received. No medals, no proclamations, only the knowledge that their efforts had made a difference. It is possible that Agent 355 never knew exactly how her reports were received. She could not have guessed all the decisions they informed or the dangers they prevented. When she passed her observations to a courier, her part was finished. What came next was out of her hands. There is a peculiar kind of humility in such work. The satisfaction lies not in recognition, but in the quiet conviction that you have done what you could. Washington understood this. Though he never named her, though no surviving letter bears a line of direct acknowledgement, his careful preservation of the network's secrecy was itself a form of respect. He protected their identities because he knew that the value of their service was inseparable from the risks they had taken. In the months following the exposure of Benedict Arnold's plot, Washington wrote to Benjamin Tallmadge, the leader of the Culper ring, commending the vigilance and intelligence that had made the discovery possible. He knew as Tallmadge knew that the outcome might have been disastrous had the chain of information failed. Tallmadge, for his part, never revealed the names of those who served under him, even decades after the war ended. When pressed for details in later years, he remained circumspect, offering only the broad outlines of what the ring had accomplished. Some might see this as an evasion, a reluctance to share credit where it was due. But it was in truth an extension of the same discipline that had kept the network alive. Silence was the price of safety then and always. In this atmosphere of discretion, the contributions of Agent 355 remained unspoken. Her reports passed into the record not as personal testimony, but as entries in codebooks and transcriptions in other hands. And when the revolution ended, there was no moment when the hidden threads were gathered and displayed for admiration. Instead, they remained exactly as they had been invisible, woven through the broader story without drawing attention to themselves. For many who study the revolution, this invisibility feels like an injustice. We want, perhaps need, to give names to those who mattered. We want to rescue them from obscurity and place them among the ranks of remembered heroes. Yet there is also something quietly fitting about the way Agent 355's story ends, or rather does not end at all. It continues as a suggestion, an incomplete portrait and acknowledgement that history often depends on those who never ask to be seen. Washington's own life is well documented. His letters fill volumes. His face is engraved on coins and monuments. But even he knew that without the efforts of people like Agent 355, his leadership might have amounted to nothing more than noble intentions. Perhaps he thought of them on the night the news of victory finally came. Perhaps he remembered the messages delivered in the darkness, the scraps of knowledge that allowed him to outmaneuver a far more powerful enemy. If he did, he never said so in any surviving letter, and maybe that is why her story endures. Because in the absence of official praise, we are left to imagine her contribution for ourselves. There is a humility in this, but also a kind of dignity. It reminds us that not all debts can be paid in words, that some forms of gratitude can only be carried silently like a candle shielded from the wind. As you think of her now, you might picture a woman folding a piece of paper she knows she can never sign. She seals it without ceremony, lifts her cloak from its hook and steps into the night. No trumpet sounds, no witness marks her passing. Yet in that moment she carries more than information. She carries the fragile promise of a different future. In the next part of this story we will reflect on the legacy of Agent 355, the way her example has inspired generations who came after, and the quiet lessons her life continues to offer. For now, you need not remember every cipher or every name. It is enough to feel the hush that comes when a life has been lived in service without expectation of reward. And in that hush, you may find a deeper kind of understanding, one that asks nothing more of you than to listen and remember. When wars end, nations are eager to commemorate their triumphs. Flags are raised, treaties are signed, and the names of generals and statesmen are etched into stone. In these public rituals there is comfort and assurance that what was fought for has been secured, that those who led will be remembered. But the story of Agent 355 reminds us that history has another side, a quieter ledger kept in the minds of those who laboured unseen. Their contributions are seldom celebrated in parades. Their names often vanish into the soft anonymity of time, and yet the impact of their work endures, woven into every outcome we take for granted. It is tempting to think of her legacy as something incomplete, an unfinished record that leaves us straining for details. We wish to know who she was, where she came from, how she felt in those decisive moments. We long for a closing chapter that will explain everything. But perhaps her story is more powerful because it resists completion. The uncertainty invites us to consider not only her life, but the many other lives that unfolded in parallel, each carrying its own unrecorded burdens. Over the years, the idea of Agent 355 has inspired countless retellings. Writers have transformed her into a symbol of courage, sometimes embellishing her story with imagined conversations and heroic deeds. In novels, she becomes the woman who outwits the finest minds of the British Army. In television series, she's reimagined as a pioneer whose choices foreshadow the later struggles for women's equality. These interpretations may not be accurate in every detail, but they are evidence of something real, the desire to honour the unseen. In her partial story, people have found a space to project their admiration, their gratitude, their recognition that no great endeavour succeeds by the efforts of the visible few alone. For historians, her legend is also a caution. It reminds us how much of the past is shaped by the limitations of the record. The official documents survive because they were designed to endure military orders, signed treaties, proclamations issued on fine parchment. But the quieter traces, personal letters, whispered confidences, small acts of solidarity are easily lost. That so little is known about Agent 355 does not mean she mattered less. If anything, it underscores how profoundly the revolution depended on people who asked for nothing in return. Her story also has a subtler legacy. It complicates the narrative of the revolution itself. For generations, history books focused on the men who drafted declarations and led armies. Yet woven through every chapter is the unacknowledged labour of women who carried messages, gathered intelligence, and sustained households while the war raged around them. To remember Agent 355 is to acknowledge that this work was not secondary or incidental. It was essential, and it required a kind of resolve that few would have chosen if they had the luxury of remaining safely at the margins. Some who study her story find in it an early example of what we now call civic duty, the belief that ordinary people have a role to play in shaping their society. Others see it as evidence of something more personal, a testament to the courage it takes to act when no one is watching. You might also see her as a reminder that the measure of a life is not always visible. It is not only the fame one attains or the monuments one inspires. Sometimes it is the quiet influence that passes unseen through other hands, changing the course of events in ways that can never be fully traced. If you imagine her legacy, you can picture a line that stretches forward from those uncertain days, a thread of example and inspiration that has touched lives far beyond her own time. In the stories of other women who risked everything for causes they believed in, there is an echo of her unseen vigilance. In the quiet determination of those who do unglamorous work, teaching, caregiving, sustaining communities, you can glimpse the same spirit. Though we do not know her name, her example endures as a form of encouragement. It suggests that you do not have to be celebrated to be essential, that the value of a life can be measured not in recognition, but in the persistence of small principled acts. Tonight, as you drift toward rest, you might reflect on the hidden legacies all around you. The gestures of kindness no one noticed, the decisions made in private that set larger changes in motion. Each of us carries the capacity to do work whose importance will never be fully known. In the next part of this story, we will turn to the hidden lives of others, those whose service, like Agent 355's, remained unrecorded, but without whom the revolution would have been impossible. For now, let the thought settle around you like a quiet comfort, that even the smallest life, when lived with purpose, leaves traces that do not fade. And somewhere beneath all the noise of history, her example still glows steady and unseen. As we draw closer to the end of this story, it is worth remembering that Agent 355 was never truly alone. Though her code name has captured our imagination, she was one among many whose lives were defined by the same quiet resolve. In every town touched by war, there were others, men and women, whose names were never recorded, who moved through their days with an unremarkable patience that belied the importance of their choices. Their labour was seldom dramatic. Often it consisted of small repeated acts carrying a message, tending the sick offering shelter to a stranger who asked no questions. These were the hidden lives that made it possible for others to stand in the light. Some of their stories have been partially recovered. In the archives of New York, you will find passing references to anonymous informants, a woman of discretion, a reliable person near the wharves, someone known to the Culper circle. These brief descriptions are all that remain, like the faintest of footprints across snow. We will never know what compelled each of them to take risks. Some may have felt a deep conviction in the promise of a new republic. Others may have acted out of loyalty to friends or family. And some perhaps were motivated simply by the refusal to do nothing in the face of injustice. In all these motivations there is something recognizable. For though the circumstances were extraordinary, the impulses were ordinary love duty, the wish to protect what felt worth protecting. Consider for a moment the women who kept safe houses along the roads that crossed Long Island and Connecticut. They had no formal training. They did not think of themselves as agents. Yet when a courier knocked at the door, exhausted and cold, they let him in without hesitation. They offered food, a place to sleep, and no questions. In their willingness to offer refuge, they became a part of the same invisible chain of trust that sustained the revolution. Others risked even more. They carried messages sewn into their clothing, or memorized entire letters in case their belongings were searched. They left no diaries describing the strain of those journeys. But if you listen carefully to the recollections left by those who survived, you will find glimpses of their presence. A soldier recalling how he escaped a patrol because someone warned him in time. A letter mentioning a note delivered by a woman whose name I did not learn. A ledger noting an anonymous payment for services rendered. These passing mentions are all that remain to testify to the scale of their involvement. Yet if you think about how many such references survive, you begin to sense the true magnitude of what was done. It is comforting in a way to realise that so much depended not on exceptional heroes, but on the persistence of ordinary people. History often celebrates decisive moments, a signature on a declaration, the last charge across a battlefield. But just as often, the outcome turned on small decisions that went unnoticed. To remember these hidden lives is to widen the lens through which we see the past. It allows us to recognise that no single leader, however brilliant, could have prevailed without a host of unnamed allies. Their collective labour was the bedrock upon which all victories rested. You might wonder whether Agent 355 knew about the others like her, whether she ever passed one of them in the market or paused in a doorway while another courier hurried by, each unaware of the other's true purpose. It is possible that she felt now and then a fleeting sense of fellowship with these unseen companions, or perhaps she preferred not to think about them, knowing that in this work knowledge could be as dangerous as ignorance. The less she knew, the less she could betray if she were caught. Whatever she believed, she shared with them the same burden to act without promise of reward, to remain silent when others spoke of glory, to measure each day by whether she had managed to do her part. When the war finally ended, many who had served in this quiet capacity returned to lives that looked much like the ones they had left behind. The fields needed planting, children needed tending. The slow work of building a nation began, and their contributions disappeared into the background hum of ordinary life. But if you look carefully, you can still find traces: the folded letters tucked among old papers, the coded ledgers in a family attic, the whispered recollections passed down in stories that began. There was someone who helped. Tonight, as you drift closer to rest, you might consider how many such lives have existed. How much of what you inherit was built by hands you will never know. It is a quiet comfort to think that even the smallest efforts matter, that every act of courage, no matter how hidden, leaves some imprint on the world. In the final part of this story, we will return to Agent 355 herself, and reflect on what her example can teach us not only about the past, but about the choices we make when no one is watching. For now, you may let your thoughts settle into stillness, like a letter folded and set aside. You have travelled far tonight across centuries and uncertain roads, in the company of those whose only wish was to do what they could. And somewhere among them she waits unseen, but never entirely forgotten. As we come to the final part of this story, you may notice that you are left with more questions than answers. This is how it often is with the lives that unfold out of sight. The record is incomplete, the voices are missing, and all we can do is listen carefully to what remains and feel our way toward an understanding. Agent 355 is in the end a symbol. She is the quiet presence behind 1,000 other stories that will never be told in full. She's a reminder that for every figure whose name appears in books and on statues, there are countless others whose courage was just as real, whose sacrifices were just as necessary. If you close your eyes, you might picture her as you wish. You might see her as a young woman standing in the doorway of a candlelit room, her expression calm as she listens to the murmured plans of men who never imagined she was listening. You might see her carrying a folded letter beneath her cloak, her footsteps measured so as not to draw attention. Or perhaps you see only a silhouette, someone you could pass on the street without a second thought, never guessing the purpose she carried. It is this ordinariness that makes her story powerful. She was not a general, nor a celebrated orator, nor a wealthy patron. She was, as best we can tell, someone who looked like everyone else. Someone whose strength lay in the fact that she did not stand out. When you consider her life, you might be tempted to ask whether she felt fear. It is likely she did. No one who understands the stakes of their actions can be entirely free of it. Yet her fear did not keep her still. She moved through it, carrying each message as if it were no different than any other duty. That is its own kind of heroism, the kind that requires no audience, no declaration, no certainty that history will ever remember. In the quiet hours after the revolution ended, there were no ceremonies held in her honour. No letters of commendation were read aloud. Perhaps she returned to the routines of her life, tending a household, caring for family, rising each day to do whatever needed doing. Perhaps she never spoke of what she had done, and those around her never thought to ask. This too is a part of her legacy. She reminds us that recognition is not the only measure of worth, that there is dignity in carrying a purpose quietly and working without praise, in offering your time and your courage simply because you believe it is right. The historian's impulse is to classify, to collect evidence, to construct a narrative that makes sense of scattered facts. But in Agent 355's case, there is no complete story to be assembled. What survives is a collection of possibilities, a shape that emerges only if you look with patience. And so as you drift towards sleep, you can let go of the need for perfect clarity. You can rest in the knowledge that some lives will always resist being pinned down. They are like the messages she carried, concealed in plain sight, meant to be understood only by those who take the time to look closely. If you find any comfort in her story, perhaps it is this, that even the smallest actions done without witness can reverberate far beyond what we can see. That in the darkness of uncertainty, the simplest conviction to do what you can be enough. Tonight, as your breathing slows and your thoughts grow softer, you may imagine her one last time. A woman with no name, we can be certain of stepping into the night with a folded letter in her hand. No one watches her pass. No one knows what she carries. But in her quiet persistence she holds the fragile promise of change. And though her name was never set in stone, it endures in the spaces between what is known and what is guessed, in the hush of unrecorded moments, in the traces that remain when everything else has faded. May her example remind you that there is strength in patience, courage in discretion, and a kind of grace in doing what must be done whether or not the world ever takes notice. Rest now in the soft understanding that history is never only what is written down, it is also what is carried in silence. And somewhere in that silence, Agent 355 waits still unseen but never quite gone. And now, as our time together drifts to its quiet end, you may allow the last images of her story to fade gently in your thoughts. Imagine the final flicker of a candle, its glow dissolving into the darkness, leaving behind only the warmth it once offered. There is no need to hold each detail tightly. You have travelled far across old streets and hushed rooms through shadows, where a woman moved unseen, carrying her purpose, like a secret folded close to her heart. Let your breathing slow as you picture her stepping into the night for the last time. Her figure dissolves into the soft veil of memory, her footsteps growing fainter, until there is only a hush, a tender stillness that holds everything she chose to do. You are safe here in this calm space between waking and sleep. All the questions you may still carry can be set aside. There will be time enough to wonder later. For now, let yourself rest in the simple comfort of knowing that her courage, quiet and uncelebrated, once helped to shape a world that was waiting to be born. Allow your eyelids to grow heavy. Feel the softness of your pillow beneath you. If you wish, you can return to this story again whenever you need a reminder that even the smallest actions offered without applause have their own lasting power. And if you'd like to explore more forgotten histories, you're welcome to visit this channel whenever your heart feels ready. There are always more gentle stories here waiting to accompany you into sleep. May you carry her example with you, a quiet strength that asks nothing but a willingness to try. Sleep well, and know that you are not alone. I'll be here whenever you need another story. Just close your eyes and come find me again.